spread the curse of undeath across the lands for thousands of years. Though almost all of them now dwell in the rain-swept forests of the north, their origins lie in the sun-baked desert cities of the land of the dead. South of the Empire, south even of the Border Princes. South of the Empire, south of the Border Princes, south even of the Badlands and Karaka Azul, lies a land of which very little is known. Even those who know its true name, Nehekara, do not say the word aloud. They refer to it in hushed tones as the land of the dead. Few men have been there and returned to tell the tale, and so the history of the land of the dead is steeped in black rumor and shrouded in mystery. A few insights can be gleaned from ancient texts, such as Abdul ben Rashid's Book of the Dead. This great tome tells of how the powerful priest king Setra conquered all the cities of the realm of Nehekara, and yet he was not content, for he could not defeat death. He set his priests to solving the mystery of immortality, and though they extended his life for many years, they could not unlock the secrets of eternal life. Following Setra's death and entombment within a vast pyramid, successive priest kings became similarly obsessed with avoiding death. Over time, the great mortuary temples and pyramids dwarfed the cities of the living, and although the endeavor was bent towards immortal life, and all thought and endeavor was bent towards immortal life. Oh, okay. I thought you guys could hear the siren. Oh, now you probably can. I'll let that pass. Eventually, this obsession with achieving immortality would bring about Nehekara's demise and, from its death throes, the birth of the vampires. The rise of Nagash. Roughly 4,500 years before the present day, Nagash was born in Kemri, largest of the cities of Nehekara. The brother of the reigning priest king, Nagash was a mighty priest well versed in the mythical incantations of his folk. From an early age, Nagash was obsessed with death, even more so than the rest of his people. Nagash wandered through the city's necropolis for weeks at a time and entered the oldest tombs without fear. He observed the morticians as they prepared the dead for internment. He watched warriors wounded in battle fade and die, and resolved that he would never succumb to such a fate. It was Nagash's capture and subsequent torture of a small party of shipwrecked dark elves that led to his discovery of dark magic. Nagash soon mastered the basics of necromancy, and the people of the city began to shun him. A natural and brilliant sorcerer, his experiments met with considerable success. Amongst the greatest of his macabre achievements was the distillation of an elixir from human blood that would grant everlasting life to its drinker. Soon, Nagash had a loyal following of noblemen, with whom he shared his discovery. In a bloody coup, Nagash seized control of Kemri and had his brother buried alive within their father's pyramid. As the years turned into decades and the decades turned into centuries, Nagash and his followers took to conducting their experiments and rituals hidden in the cool, dark places in the palatial tombs of the necropolis. They began to shun the light altogether as they made plans for their dark ascension. That's a pretty good magic card. Nagash supervised the building of a great black pyramid, one of the mightiest structures ever attempted by men. It cost a great many lives to build, but the blood, sweat, and souls given to its construction only increased its potency, for the pyramid was designed to attract the foul winds of dark magic. For the priest kings of the other cities, long disturbed by events in Kemri, this was the final blasphemy. They formed an alliance against Nagash and sent their armies into battle with him. During the long war that followed, waves of dark power blasted the lands. Many of Nehekara's oases were so saturated that they became as dismal and lifeless as the surrounding desert. After nearly a century of constant warfare, however, the armies of the priest king succeeded in sacking Kemri. As Nagash fled from the burning city into the cold depths of his pyramid, the great necromancer swore to the priest kings in their cities that their cities would become as dust. The priest kings laughed. One by one they found Nagash's disciples within the pyramid and dragged them out screaming to be burned and beheaded in the sunlight. All of the morbid statues and monuments to Nagash's glory were toppled into the sand. The sanctums of the necromancer's disciples were despoiled, and the practice of dark magic was outlawed on pain of death. Yet the agents of the priest kings, could not find the renegade himself. Although his disciples claimed to have seen Nagash enter his sarcophagus, the coffin itself was mysteriously empty. That sounds kind of like Dracula. The damnation of Lamia. In defiance of the laws imposed by the priest kings, Neferata, the queen of Lamia, stole the most potent of Nagash's books and pursued her own studies in the dark arts. She attempted to replicate the elixir of life, and eventually she had a small measure of success. Neferata no longer seemed to age, but was possessed of a terrible thirst for blood. Over time, many of the court of Neferata also drank the elixir and joined her as vampire lords and ladies. Thus was the dynasty of the Lamian vampires born into the world. More cautious than Nagash, they took pains to conceal their nature from the other priest kings. The first vampires reigned like gods over Lamia, governed by their undying queen and hidden from the ire of the priest kings. Gradually, the vampire covens of Lamia began to grow in confidence, and their excesses increased. They would not submit to walk the earth like common soldiers, and insisted upon being borne upon ornate thrones at all times. Hundreds of slaves entered their palaces every day and were never seen again. These vampires also learned that Nagash had not been destroyed, but was rebuilding his power in the citadel of Cripple Peak, which would become known as Nagashazar. Enthralled to the great necromancer and bound to him by the corrupted elixir of life, the rulers of Lamia sent envoys to Cripple Peak. Agents of the priest kings captured and interrogated some of these heralds, and the vampire's existence was uncovered. Enraged beyond measure, the priest kings once more amassed their armies and made war. The fight for Lamia was long and bloody, with the deadly vampires using their strength and sorcerous skill to slay hundreds of the priest kings' warriors. Yet the priest kings were not without magic of their own, and their armies numbered in the tens of thousands. Eventually, the vampires lost the battle. The population of Lamia was enslaved, the pyramids smashed, and the vampires driven out. Most fled northward, one by one, arriving in Nagashazar to be welcomed by the great necromancer Nagash, looked upon the corrupt immortals and was pleased. I'm sorry, I missed a period there. The vampires were worthy champions for his armies, their damnation a tribute to his dark genius. War with the priest kings. Nagash had not been idle, and had learned much about the art of necromancy and animating the dead. Conceiving of a mad and deadly master plan, he vowed to turn the entire world into a necropolis filled only by the unquiet dead, where no action would be performed, no deed done, save when he willed it. Nagash would be the lord over all of it. The first step on Nagash's road to utter dominion was the elimination of his former homeland, for he wished a bitter vengeance upon the priest kings. At his command, the vampires led his legions forth to war. On ships made of fused bone, the undead horde made its way from the sour sea, down what future generations would know as the Straits of Nagash to the Bitter Sea. The undead legions made landfall at the ruined port of Lamia and surged forwards on their mortal foes, the exiled vampires spearing the attack. However, Nagash had seriously underestimated his former countrymen. In the time of his absence, the land of the great Vitae River had become a mighty empire ruled by a single priest king, Alcatazar the Conqueror. Alcatazar was the greatest general of his age, and his empire was at the zenith of its power. When the undead came, they found themselves opposed by a unified, confident army. Moreover, the enchanters of the Great Kingdom had made progress in the arts of magic, particularly in the creation of animated war constructs. No easy victory was possible against them. The ensuing wars stained the sands red for many years. The vampires were mighty sorcerers and fell warriors, and they were determined to reclaim their kingdom. Wherever they appeared, terror and dread came upon the enemy, yet the vampires were not invincible. The war swayed backwards and forwards for a decade. At first, the legions of the undead had the upper hand. Then the armies of Alcatazar struck back with displays of tactical genius. Battle after battle was fought until all of Nagash's legions were destroyed. The defeated vampires fled across the desert to Nagashazar to bring their dark master the report of their failure. Great was Nagash's rage. He cursed the vampiric captains that had failed him. Ever afterward, they would know constant pain, and their howling cries would carry the knowledge of their misery to all men. The remaining vampires fled Nagashazar by night, dispersing in all directions to confuse pursuit. Even after Nagash's death at the hands of Alcatazar, the vampires bore his curse. Thus, the first vampires disappeared across the world, each founding their own bloodthirsty dynasty that would endure and grow throughout the centuries, terrorizing the living to the present day. The Vampire Wars. In the eastern reaches of Stirland, under the cold shadow of the World's Edge Mountains, lies Sylvania. This land of bleak hills, blasted moorlands, and mist-shrouded forests is shunned by all sensible travelers, and is without doubt the most ill-famed region in the Empire. No sane man would venture forth after dark, and no questing knight or weary pilgrim ever accepts shelter within the brooding, rotting castles that tower over the land. By night, the brutish peasants of the squalid villages lock and bar their doors and hang bundles of witchbane and demon root over their shutters to ward against the evils of the night. For as long as any man can remember, evil tales have been told of Sylvania. The odds are good that if ever a tavern bard is reciting a grisly ballad or a court poet inscribing a story of horror, then the setting will be this dire place. Sylvania is indeed a land where unquiet spirits, thirsty vampires, and evil sorcerers still walk beneath the moon's pale light. The winds of magic blow strong in Sylvania, and the keeps of the nobility are built over particularly ill-omened sites. Even the notoriously violent and fearless Stirland tax collectors wear amulets blessed by priests of Mor and Sigmar, and go about their business in 50-strong companies whenever their elector count compels them to seek his due. The madness of Otto von Drac. The nadir of this dark land came when Vlad von Carstein took rulership of Sylvania. It began on a storm-lashed night when Otto, last of the mad von Drac counts, lay on his deathbed in Castle Drakenhof, cursing the gods that he was without a male heir to continue his legacy. Otto was a cruel man, fond of putting the heads of peasants on spikes at the slightest provocation, and when crazed with drink he was convinced that he was Sigmar reincarnated. The nobles of his court had no respect for his authority and paid no attention to his commands. Sylvania seethed with strife. As his family keenly awaited his final breath, Otto swore he would marry his daughter Isabella to a demon rather than let his hated brother Leopold inherit. Otto had already refused his daughter's hand to every noble in Sylvania, for he despised them all. No man of breeding from beyond the borders of von Drac's realm wanted to marry a Sylvanian heiress, and so it was that when Isabella von Drac knelt at Otto's deathbed, she was still without a husband. Outside, thunder rumbled and lightning split the storm-black darkness. Victor Gutman, the aged priest of Sigmar, who had been called to shrive the old count, fainted away. Then, from out of the storm came the sound of wheels and pounding hooves. A dark coach, pulled by 4 smote the door a ringing blow, and a proud voice demanded entry. The arrival of Vlad. The castle gate swung open on its hinges before any man-at-arms could touch it. The visitor was revealed, and as one, the baying guard dogs ceased to howl and slunk away. The stranger was tall, darkly handsome, and of noble bearing and aspect. No one stayed his entry as he marched directly to the Count's chamber. The newcomer's accent was foreign, perhaps from Kislev or even further afield. He named himself as Vlad von Carstein, and recited his noble antecedents to the Count. He then claimed the wide-eyed Isabella's hand in marriage. Looking into the stranger's cold, dead eyes, the Count perhaps regretted his rash oath, but before he knew it, he had given his blessing nonetheless. The priest Gutman was revived from his swoon and brought to the chambers of Otto, where the marriage ceremony was performed before the dying Count's bed. Almost as soon as the last of the ritual words were spoken, Otto von Drac expired, leaving his daughter and his entire estate in the charge of Vlad von Carstein. The new Count's first act was to hurl Isabella's uncle Leopold through the window of the highest tower of Castle Drakenhof. Vlad seemed as eccentric as old Otto. He never ate in the servant's presence. He never walked abroad by day. He dismissed the elderly Sigmarite priest and sent him from the town. No one ever saw Victor Gutman again. Soon, many of the old servants at the keep were dismissed, and mysterious, swarthy strangers took their place. However, the new Count seemed less oppressive than the old one, and so the folk of Sylvania got on with their daily business, ignoring the hooded and cloaked foreigners that often visited the castle. Years of punitive von Drac rule had taught them not to question the deeds of their betters. All that concerned the lower classes was that at least the new Count didn't order senseless executions or demand exorbitant taxes at a whim. No one doubted the Count's prowess in battle either. When the famed company of Baranov the Butcher rode into town and demanded tribute, Vlad cut the veteran mercenary down as if he were a stripling. The Count then proceeded to slaughter the entire mercenary band while his company watched, picking their teeth and making smug comments. The Count's popularity was assured. Within his realm, the laws were kept, and the guilty were punished without mercy. The healing of Isabella. Scant days later, word reached Drakenhof that Isabella had fallen sick with an incurable illness. One of the physicians who tended her claimed her heart had stopped. The new Count insisted this was not so. He dismissed the learned doctors, claiming he would care for her with his own hands. 3 days later, she appeared in front of her folk, saying she was fully recovered. She was ever afterwards pale and wan, however, and never left her chambers save by moonlight. At first, none of the feuding nobles of Sylvania paid any heed to the commands of the new Count. If this bothered Vlad, he gave no sign of it. The Count cherished his tenants as a peasant family cherishes a beast they are fattening for the midsummer feast. After decades of rule by Mad Otto, this new order was welcomed by all save the most paranoid. After several months, however, dark things began to happen. Young men and women from the villages began to disappear. The living dead gathered at the borders of each settlement in growing numbers. These were small forces at first, and they came after only those who disobeyed the Count's authority. If any rebellious Sylvanians escaped the clutches of the undead, then they quickly fell victim to strange accidents. Only those who had sworn allegiance to Vlad von Carstein seemed immune to these depredations. Soon, the renegade nobles of Sylvania were queuing up to swear fealty to him. Within 10 years, Vlad was more firmly in control of unruly Sylvania than the elector counts were of the largest states in the empire. Some remarked that such was Vlad's success as a ruler, he should in fact sit upon the imperial throne. After all, the von Carsteins were an ancient family that could trace their lineage back to the founding of the empire. Generations later, Vlad and Isabella still presided over the lands, unchanged by the years. At first, few paid attention to lives of peasants had always been squalid and short, and nobles had always enjoyed vastly longer lifespans. However, when the oldest woman of Drakenhof insisted that her grandmother had been a girl when Vlad von Carstein came to the throne, even the most dim-witted peasantry began to surmise that all was not as it seemed. The spreading rumors drew more and more witch hunters to Sylvania. Those who chose to investigate the von Carsteins were never seen again. Yet worse was to come. The mysterious disease that had first laid low Isabella von Carstein struck other noble families allied with the Count. Soon, every castle in Sylvania was home to long-lived nocturnal folk, pallid of aspect and merciless in their rule. The number of the living who went missing became more and more noticeable. The temples of Sigmar, Tal, and Ulrich were closed. The priests of Mor were driven from the region, and the dead were left untended to pile at the sides of the roads. Grim watchposts were set up along the border, and few were allowed to cross, either into or out of Sylvania. When catastrophe struck the Ostermark capital of Mordheim in the year 2000, Vlad was swift to act. A great meteor of warpstone had destroyed half the city, and shards of raw magic littered the ruins. As the claimants to the imperial throne sent mercenary forces to seize this new source of power, so too did Vlad send dark minions forth into the ruins. It would be another decade before the strange seeds harvested from that blighted city would bear fruit. Vlad marches forth. On Geheimnisnacht in the year 2010, Vlad von Carstein revealed the nightmarish truth to the world. The Count of Sylvania stood upon the battlements of Castle Drakenhof and intoned a terrible incantation he had taken from one of the 9 books of Nagash. Fueled by the warpstone recovered from Mordheim, Vlad's magic flowed over Sylvania, coiling through the unguarded gardens of Mor and pooling in open peasant graves. Across Vlad's lands, the dead awoke. Skeletons clawed their way through the peaty soil. Zombies stirred in their muddy holes. Ghouls loped from their crypt lairs to worship their new master. With this act, Vlad von Carstein had thrown down the gauntlet to the Empire. The wars of the vampire counts had begun. The Sylvanian armies headed northwest. They crossed the river Styr and headed for Talabheim. The undead force blackened the horizon with its numbers, for each of the vampire aristocracy of Sylvania led a whole army of skeletons and zombies. Perhaps stranger still, the peasant levies of that land marched alongside their undead masters. At the Battle of Essenford, the undead faced the Talabheimland army of Ottilia III. Before the battle, Vlad von Carstein promised the humans clemency if they surrendered, and no mercy if they opposed him. Though fearful, Ottilia, man, that's a weird name, Ottilia's general ordered the attack. Crossbows and bullets cut a swath through the legions of undead as they crossed the ford, but Vlad's magic reanimated his fallen minions once more and spurred them forward. Nightly charges destroyed hundreds of walking corpses, but still thousands more pressed onwards in an unstoppable wall of flesh and bone. Vengeful spirits and spectral horsemen swept through the Talabheimland lines, shrieking and killing, while the never-ending army of zombies dragged down soldier after soldier. Embattled against a seemingly endless horde of the dead, Ottilia's forces were encircled. Vlad led the final attack himself at the head of his Black Knights, while the Whites of the Drakenhof Guard surrounded the enemy general. Faced with the power of Vlad and his fellow vampires, the forces of Ottilia were overwhelmed. Many surrendered, but Vlad was true to his word. His followers butchered every captive, and then Vlad used his powers to reanimate their bodies and add them to his growing legion. As he watched his men executed and then raised up once more as zombies, Ottilia's general, Hans Schlieffen, became so incensed that he flew into a berserk rage. Schlieffen broke free from his captor's grasp, seized the Count's own enchanted sword from its scabbard, and struck off Vlad's head. Schlieffen was immediately torn limb from limb by Conrad von Carstein, most deranged of the Count's followers. With Vlad seemingly destroyed, the remaining vampires squabbled amongst themselves to see who would take his place. Hermann Posner, Baron of Waldenhof, finally prevailed. That very night, as Posner strutted at the head of the army, Vlad von Carstein returned. Posner threw himself at Vlad's mercy, but was cut down without a moment's thought. With the army of Talabeclan smashed, Vlad turned his attention even further westward, towards the fortress city of Middenheim. At the Battle of Schwarzhafen, Vlad was cut down by Gerrit Kruger, leader of the Knights of the White Wolf, and amongst great turmoil and confusion, the army of Sylvania was defeated. Yet within a year, Vlad von Carstein was leading another army to war. Grandmaster Kruger's smashed and bloodless body was found at the foot of the Middenheim spire. The Knights of the White Wolf and Knights Panther were scattered by Vlad's undead creatures and winged giants that swooped down from the skies. The soldiers of Middenheim retreated to the city and destroyed the causeways leading up to the gates. Content that the Graf of Middenheim's army posed no more threat to his ambition, Vlad ravaged Midland to further swell his forces. At every village and town he came across, Vlad offered the same bargain: serve him and live, oppose him and die. At first, many tried to fight the undead, but all suffered the same fate as Ottilia III's army before them. Vlad's undead legion grew ever larger and stronger. Soon, miles-long columns of refugees fled westward, fearful of the relentless onslaught of Vlad's undead army. Vlad turned his attention eastward and fought along the old forest road through Hochland into Ostland. Army after army was sent to check his advance, but the result of every battle was the same. The Undying Legion slew their enemies in a battle of attrition the living could not hope to win. Nothing seemed to stop Vlad. Every time it appeared he had been slain, he returned to wreak his revenge. At Bluthof, the vampire count fell with 5 lances through his body, and the Count of Ostland's runefang lodged in his heart. 3 days later, Vlad was seen ordering the execution of prisoners outside the gates of Bluthof. With the northern provinces overrun and their armies smashed, Vlad turned south and made for Reichland. At Bogenhofen Bridge, a lucky cannon shot took von Carstein's head clean off. Within the hour, the cannon crew were drained of blood and the army overrun. Altdorf besieged. By the winter of 2051, the Sylvanians laid siege to Altdorf, capital of Reichland. The great city was surrounded by a leagues-long ditch edged with sharpened stakes, and the Reich had been redirected into the ditch to give the city a moat of fast-flowing water. None of the precautions taken by the defenders worked. They did not stop the von Carsteins and their allies for a moment. Great siege engines built of fused human remains lumbered forward, animated by dark magic, while carrion crows and blood-sucking bats circled greedily overhead. Vlad gave his usual ultimatum: open the gates and serve him in life, or fight on and serve him in death. Ludwig, the Reichland's claimant to the imperial throne, wanted to surrender. The Grand Theogenist Wilhelm III, High Priest of the Cult of Sigmar, convinced him to defy Vlad instead. Wilhelm cloistered himself within the great temple of Sigmar. After 3 days of prayer, he emerged once more, claiming that Sigmar had revealed the salvation of the Empire to him. That same day, Wilhelm dispatched an agent to the Vampire Count's camp. His name was Felix Mann, and he was the greatest thief of the age. His task was to steal the Vampire Count's ornate ring. By stealth or trickery, Mann made his way to the heart of the Sylvanian camp. Heart in mouth, he entered the great black silk pavilion where the undead aristocrats lay sleeping in open coffins. That's pretty extra. The master thief, Mann, slipped the ring from von Carstein's finger and fled, never to return. No one knows what became of him. When he woke, Vlad was enraged and ordered an immediate attack on the city. The undead army surged forwards under the burning will of the Vampire Count, and great siege towers of bone were wheeled to the walls. On the towering battlements, skeletons and Reichlander swordsmen hacked at each other. Imperial hero heroes armed with ancient weapons taken from the vaults of the city cut down the vampire aristocrats and were, in their turn, chopped apart. At the center of the vast struggle that engulfed the city, the Grand Theogenist clashed with the vampire Count Vlad. After an hour of combat, holy hammer against magical blade, Vlad gained the upper hand, for his foe was tiring, and he was not. Sensing that the end was near, Wilhelm charged his foe headlong and flung himself and Vlad over the battlements. The two fell together, locked in an embrace of death. First, Vlad was impaled on a wooden spike at the foot's wall, and then Wilhelm landed on top, driving the Count still further on. With an awful scream, the Count expired, for without the power of his magical ring, Vlad at last proved vulnerable. With Count Vlad destroyed and his armies crumbling, the Sylvanians were forced to lift the siege and retreat. So great were the casualties inflicted on the men of Altdorf that no pursuit was possible. The last casualty of the Battle of Altdorf was Isabella von Carstein. Unable to face eternity without her husband, she impaled herself on a stake and shriveled to a pile of dust before the eyes of the would-be Emperor Ludwig and his bodyguard. Ludwig would have pressed into Sylvania and taken the fight to the evil scourge at its heart, but the other claimants to the imperial throne joined forces against him, fearing that Ludwig would use his new popularity to secure his claim to the throne. So the pernicious lords of Sylvania were able to regain their strength. And that is where we are going to end our video today, just so it doesn't get too long. Because I do want you guys to actually listen to the whole thing and be able to appreciate all this cool shit that's happening. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video.